Charleston, 1836. A woman walked into a storm holding nothing but a black parasol, and when the rain stopped, she was gone. But the umbrella remained standing upright in the courtyard, water dripping from its edges as if held by invisible hands. The neighbors would whisper for generations that whenever rain fell on that spot, the umbrella would open again on its own, waiting for a woman who never returned. What happened to Dinah Carter on that strange August evening? And why did she leave behind the one thing that might have kept her dry? The answer lies somewhere between the cobblestones of Charleston and a freedom that couldn't be chained. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning Dinah Carter disappeared began like every other morning in the Whitmore household on Trad Street. She rose before dawn, her bare feet silent against the pine floors of the attic room she shared with 3 other enslaved women. The air already held the thickness of August heat, promising another day when breathing would feel like drowning on dry land. Dinah moved through the darkness with practiced ease, finding her plain gray dress where she had hung it the night before, smoothing the wrinkles with her palms because there was no time and certainly no iron available for someone of her station. She was 32 years old that summer, though she looked both older and younger depending on the light. Her face carried the kind of beauty that persisted despite exhaustion. High cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations without ever speaking a word. Her hands told a different story, roughened by years of laundry soap and scalding water, scrubbing the fine linens of the Whitmore family until her knuckles cracked and bled. She wrapped them in strips of cloth at night, a small mercy she granted herself when the day's work was finally done. The Whitmores owned a modest townhouse by Charleston standards. Nothing like the grand mansions that lined the Battery with their piazzas and gardens stretching toward the harbor. Malcolm Whitmore had made his fortune in rice, though recently that fortune had begun to show signs of strain. His wife, Constance, spent her days maintaining the appearance of wealth they could barely afford, hosting teas with china they could not replace and wearing gowns that had been turned and remade 3 times over. They owned 7 enslaved people, and Dinah had been with them since she was 19, purchased from an estate sale after her previous owner died intestate and his creditors came calling. Dinah's memories of the time before the Whitmores had faded like old watercolors left too long in the sun. She had been born on a plantation 30 miles inland, the daughter of a woman whose name she could barely remember and a father who might have been the overseer, or might have been one of the field hands. No one had ever told her which, and by the time she was old enough to ask, her mother was already gone, sold away when Dinah was 7. She remembered her mother's hands more than her face. Long fingers that could braid hair into intricate patterns and pick cotton faster than any 3 men combined. On that August morning, Dinah descended the narrow stairs to the kitchen where she found the cook, an older woman named Bessie, already stoking the fire in the massive hearth. Bessie had been with the Whitmores longer than anyone, her hair now completely white beneath the faded headscarf she wore. She glanced at Dinah with knowing eyes that had seen too much and said too little over the decades. "Storm coming," Bessie said without preamble, her voice raspy from years of breathing in wood smoke. "Can feel it in my bones. Big one too, the kind that changes things." Dinah nodded, moving to collect the breakfast trays she would carry upstairs to the family. The Whitmores rose late as befitted their station, but they expected their meal promptly at 8 o'clock, and Constance Whitmore had a sharp tongue for anyone who made her wait. Dinah had learned long ago that silence and efficiency were the best defenses against that tongue. So she moved with quiet purpose, arranging the dishes precisely as Mistress Whitmore preferred. "You've been awful quiet lately," Bessie continued, kneading dough for the day's bread with strong, steady movements. "Quieter than usual, I mean. Something troubling you, child?" Dinah paused, her hands hovering over a silver tray that probably cost more than her entire life was worth to the Whitmores. Something was troubling her. Had been troubling her for weeks now, but putting it into words felt dangerous. Words had power, her mother had told her once, and some words once spoken could never be taken back. "Just tired," Dinah said finally, which was true enough even if it wasn't the whole truth. She was tired, bone-deep tired in a way that sleep never seemed to cure. Tired of waking in the dark and working until dark fell again. Tired of being owned, of having every moment of her existence determined by someone else's desires and demands. But more than that, she was restless, filled with a strange energy that made her skin feel too tight, as if something inside her was trying to break free. Bessie studied her for a long moment, her hands never pausing in their work. "You be careful," she said quietly. "I seen that look before in folks who about to do something foolish. This ain't the time or place for foolishness, Dinah. You understand me?" Dinah nodded again, though she wasn't sure she did understand. Wasn't sure Bessie understood what was happening inside her because Dinah herself didn't fully comprehend it. She only knew that lately, whenever she looked at the locked doors and barred windows of the Whitmore house, she felt something close to rage, hot and bright and terrifying in its intensity. She carried the breakfast trays upstairs, her movements automatic after so many years of the same routine. The Whitmore's bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the street, and Dinah knocked softly before entering. Constance Whitmore was already awake, sitting at her dressing table in a lace nightgown, studying her reflection with the critical eye of a woman fighting a losing battle against time. "You're late," Constance said without turning around, though Dinah knew she wasn't late at all. The clock on the mantel showed precisely 8 o'clock. "No, ma'am," Dinah said quietly, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "Right on time." Constance turned then, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was 45 years old and beautiful in the way that expensive maintenance could achieve, her skin pale and unlined, her hair still dark thanks to regular applications of dye that Dinah herself prepared. But her eyes were hard, the kind of hardness that came from years of disappointed expectations and diminished circumstances. "Don't contradict me," Constance said sharply. "I said you're late, so you're late. Do you understand?" Dinah lowered her eyes, swallowing the words that wanted to spill out. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. And this tea is cold. Take it back and bring me fresh. Actually hot this time." The tea wasn't cold, Dinah knew, because she had poured it herself less than 2 minutes ago, but she reached for the pot without argument. This was how Constance Whitmore exercised her power through these small, petty cruelties that reminded Dinah of her place. Some days Dinah could bear it with equanimity, could let the words slide off her like water off waxed canvas. But today, something in her rebelled, though she kept her face carefully blank. As she left the room, she heard Malcolm Whitmore stirring in the adjoining chamber, his morning cough rattling through the walls. He was a softer man than his wife, prone to moments of what he probably considered kindness, though his kindness never extended to the actual freedom or fair treatment of the people he owned. He gave them Christmas gifts, extra rations on holidays, and spoke to them in a jovial tone that suggested he believed they were all one happy family. Dinah found his false geniality more offensive than his wife's open cruelty. At least Constance was honest about what she was. By midday, the storm Bessie had predicted began to gather on the horizon. Dinah could see it from the upstairs windows as she changed the linens in the guest bedrooms, dark clouds rolling in from the Atlantic like an invading army. The air grew heavier, pressing down on the city with an almost physical weight, and the usual sounds of Charleston, the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones, The calls of street vendors, the distant ring of church bells seemed muted and far away. She worked through the afternoon washing clothes in the courtyard, the heat making her dress stick to her back with sweat. The Whitmore's courtyard was small but well-maintained, with a fountain that no longer worked and beds of roses that Dinah tended when she had time between her other duties. A large magnolia tree provided some shade, its waxy leaves rustling in the building wind, and beneath it stood a small shed where garden tools were kept. As she wrung out a white petticoat, squeezing the excess water until her forearms ached, Dinah became aware of someone watching her. She looked up to find a man standing at the courtyard gate, his face partially obscured by the iron bars. He was young, perhaps 25, with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that seemed to see right through her. "You Dinah Carter?" he asked quietly, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the wind. Dinah straightened, caution making her movements slow. Strangers didn't usually address enslaved people by name unless they brought trouble. "Who's asking?" "Name's Marcus Webb. I got a message for you from someone who says they knew your mama." Dinah's heart began to pound, hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Her mother had been dead for years, sold away, and then, according to rumors that had filtered back, worked to death in the rice fields of a plantation near Georgetown. But the possibility that someone had known her, had remembered her, made Dinah's hands shake as she abandoned the laundry and moved closer to the gate. "What message?" she asked, keeping her voice low. If the Whitmores found her talking to a strange man, there would be consequences. Marcus glanced over his shoulder, checking the street behind him, then leaned closer to the bars. "Your mama had a sister. Did you know that? A sister named Ruth who bought her own freedom 15 years back and been living in Philadelphia ever since. She been looking for you, Dinah, looking for a long time. Sent me down here to find you and tell you there's a way out if you want it, a way north." The words seemed to hang in the humid air between them, so impossible that Dinah almost laughed. A way north. Freedom. These were the kinds of dreams that got people killed. The kinds of hopes that led to whipping posts and slave patrols and bloodhounds baying in the night. And yet hearing them spoken aloud made something in Dinah's chest crack open. Some door she had sealed shut years ago because keeping it closed was the only way to survive. "How?" she managed to ask, though her mouth had gone dry. "How would I even get to the city limits without papers?" "There's people who help," Marcus said. "A network, you might say. Folks who believe no human being ought to own another. They got safe houses, routes north, contacts in every city between here and the Pennsylvania line. Your Aunt Ruth, she got resources now. She married a doctor, a free black man with money and connections. She willing to pay for your passage, set you up in Philadelphia once you get there. All you got to do is say yes and be ready when the time comes." Dinah stared at him, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. And yet Marcus stood there, solid and real, waiting for her answer with patient eyes that suggested he had done this before, had offered this same impossible hope to others in her situation. "When?" she whispered. "Soon. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow night. Depends on the weather and the patrols. Someone will come for you, signal you when it's safe. You'll need to bring nothing. Wear your plainest clothes and be ready to walk. And Dinah," he paused, his expression grave, "once you start down this road, there ain't no going back. You get caught, they'll sell you south. Somewhere so far away you'll never see Charleston again. Or worse. You understand what you'd be risking?" Dinah nodded slowly. She understood. She understood that she was risking everything, her life, what little security she had, the familiar corners of a world she knew even if she hated it. But she also understood that she was 32 years old and had never once made a choice about her own existence, had never walked down a street simply because she wanted to see where it led, had never kept the money her hands earned or decided what time she would wake or sleep or eat. She had been owned since birth, and the thought of dying that way, of never knowing what it meant to belong to herself, was suddenly more terrifying than any punishment the Whitmores could devise. "I understand," she said. "I'll be ready." Marcus nodded and turned to leave, but Dinah called him back. "Wait, you said someone who knew my mama sent you. Who was it? What did they tell you about her?" Marcus's expression softened. "Woman name of Grace used to work the same plantation as your mama. She in Philadelphia now, too, got out about 10 years back. She said to tell you your mama's last words were about you. She said, 'Tell my Dinah to be free. Tell her to fly far away and never look back.' Grace said your mama made her promise to find you if she ever could, to tell you that." Tears burned in Dinah's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She couldn't afford tears, not now. Not with the Whitmore's windows overlooking the courtyard and Constance Whitmore's sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you for telling me." Marcus slipped away then, disappearing into the afternoon crowds, and Dinah returned to her laundry with hands that trembled so badly she could barely grip the wet fabric. "Be free, fly far away." Her mother's words, carried across years and miles by a stranger's kindness, echoed in her head like a prayer or a command or both. The storm broke just after supper when the Whitmores had retired to the parlor and Dinah was clearing the dining room table. The first drops hit the windows like thrown pebbles, and within minutes the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the streets into rivers and the courtyards into lakes. Thunder rolled across the city, shaking the old house to its foundations, and lightning illuminated the rooms in stark flashes of white light. Constance Whitmore rang for Dinah, her bell echoing through the house with its familiar imperious tone. Dinah climbed the stairs, her heart still racing from Marcus's visit, from the impossible choice now laid before her. She found Constance in the parlor, embroidery forgotten in her lap, staring out at the storm with an expression of distaste. "I need you to go to Mrs. Ashford's house," Constance said without preamble. "I left my good fan there this afternoon when I called, and I'll need it for tomorrow's tea. Go fetch it now." Dinah stared at her mistress, certain she had misheard. "Now, ma'am? In this storm? Are you questioning me?" Constance's voice went cold and sharp. "I said now. Mrs. Ashford lives 3 streets over. You can be there and back in 20 minutes if you hurry. Take the umbrella from the hall stand." It was petty cruelty again, unnecessary and mean-spirited, sending Dinah out in dangerous weather simply because Constance could, because asserting power over someone else made her feel better about her own declining circumstances. Dinah wanted to refuse, to say no for the first time in her life, but she thought of Marcus's words, "Be ready," and realized that perhaps this was the opportunity she had been promised. The storm would keep people indoors, would make the streets harder for patrols to navigate, would provide cover for someone trying to slip away unseen. "Yes, ma'am," Dinah said quietly. "Right away." She descended to the entrance hall where an old black umbrella stood in the stand by the door. It was a man's umbrella, large and sturdy, with a wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. Dinah had carried it before on errands for the Whitmores, holding it over Constance's head while getting soaked herself. Now she opened it as she stepped out into the storm, feeling the rain immediately assault the taut fabric overhead. The streets of Charleston were nearly empty, the sensible people having taken shelter from the downpour. Water rushed along the cobblestones in fast-moving streams, carrying debris and refuse toward the harbor. Dinah's shoes were soaked within seconds, her dress clinging to her legs. But she kept walking, the umbrella held high, her mind racing with possibilities. Mrs. Ashford's house was on Church Street, a narrow three-story building with shutters painted dark green. Dinah had been there many times before, carrying messages or returning borrowed items, playing the role of the invisible servant that white Charleston society preferred their enslaved people to be. But tonight, as she approached the house, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. Standing in the shadows of a doorway across from Mrs. Ashford's house was Marcus Webb, water streaming from his hat, his eyes fixed on her with intense concentration. He gave a small nod, just the barest inclination of his head, and Dinah understood. This was it. This was the moment. If she went into Mrs. Ashford's house and retrieved the fan, she would return to the Whitmores and her life would continue unchanged, an endless succession of days identical to all the ones that came before. But if she walked past that door, if she followed Marcus into the storm and the darkness beyond, everything would change. Her mother's words came back to her, "Be free, fly far away," and Dinah realized she had already made her choice, had perhaps made it the moment Marcus first spoke to her in the courtyard. She walked past Mrs. Ashford's house without breaking stride, her head down against the rain, following Marcus as he slipped from the doorway and led her through a maze of alleys and back streets she had never known existed. They moved quickly and in silence, Marcus clearly familiar with the route. They passed behind warehouses and through the yards of houses whose occupants never looked out their windows to see two black figures moving through the storm. The rain was their ally, masking their footsteps and keeping potential witnesses indoors. Dinah's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, fear and exhilaration mixing until she couldn't tell them apart. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, Marcus led her to a small house near the edge of the city, where the wealthy neighborhoods gave way to the areas where free people of color and poor whites lived in close proximity. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more, and the door opened immediately. An older white woman stood in the doorway, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face lined with years of what looked like both hardship and determination. She took in Dinah's appearance, the soaked dress and the black umbrella, and stepped back without a word. "Come in, child," the woman said, her accent marking her as a Quaker. "Thee is safe here for now." Dinah stumbled inside, suddenly aware that she was still holding the Whitmore's umbrella. It seemed absurd that she had carried it all this way, but she couldn't quite bring herself to let it go, as if dropping it would make this real in a way she wasn't yet ready to accept. The house was small and plainly furnished, but warm and dry. The woman who introduced herself as Margaret Foster brought towels and a dry dress that smelled of lavender and soap. Marcus had already disappeared into another room, and Dinah found herself alone with Margaret, who moved with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis. "Thee must change out of those wet clothes," Margaret said, pressing the bundle into Dinah's hands. "Then thee will eat something and rest. At dawn, friends will come to take thee to the next safe house, and from there thee will begin thy journey north." "Just like that?" Dinah heard herself ask, her voice sounding strange and distant. "It's really happening?" Margaret's expression softened, and she reached out to touch Dinah's cheek with gentle fingers. "It's really happening, child. Thee is taking the first steps toward freedom. It won't be easy. The road ahead is long and dangerous, and there are those who will hunt thee every step of the way. But there are also those who will help, who believe as I do that no person should be property. Thee must be brave now. Can thee do that?" Dinah nodded, though she wasn't sure she felt brave at all. Terrified seemed more accurate. She changed into the dry clothes, the dress hanging loose on her thin frame, and sat at Margaret's kitchen table while the older woman heated soup on the stove. Through the window, Dinah could see the storm continuing unabated, rain drumming against the glass with relentless intensity. It was only then, as she sat in this stranger's kitchen eating soup that no one had ordered her to prepare, that the full weight of what she had done began to settle over her. She had left. She had walked away from the only life she had ever known, from the people who owned her and the routines that had defined her existence. The Whitmores would have discovered her absence by now. Constance would be furious, Malcolm would be calculating the financial loss of her escape, and they would have already sent word to the authorities. By tomorrow, there would be notices in the papers, rewards offered for her capture and return. "What will happen to them?" Dinah asked quietly. "The Whitmores, I mean, when they can't find me." Margaret ladled more soup into Dinah's bowl. "Thee must not concern thyself with thy former captors, child. They will survive the loss of thy labor as they have survived every other inconvenience in their privileged lives. Thee must think only of thy own survival now." But Dinah found she couldn't stop thinking about the house on Trad Street, about Bessie in the kitchen who had warned her against foolishness, about the roses in the courtyard that would need tending, about all the small details of life that would continue without her. Part of her couldn't quite believe she had really left, that she had traded the terrible security of enslavement for the uncertain promise of freedom. She must have dozed off in the chair because the next thing she knew, Marcus was shaking her gently awake. The storm had passed, and pale dawn light was filtering through the windows. Outside, she could hear the city beginning to stir, the familiar sounds of Charleston waking to a new day. "Time to go," Marcus said softly. "There's a wagon waiting. You'll hide beneath the false floor with supplies for the journey. The driver will take you to a farm about 20 miles north where you'll rest during the day and continue tomorrow night. From there, it's a series of safe houses, each one bringing you closer to the Pennsylvania line." Dinah rose on shaky legs, her body sore from the tension of the previous night. Margaret pressed a bundle into her hands, food wrapped in cloth and a small leather purse that clinked with coins. "From thy aunt," Margaret explained. "She sent funds to help with thy passage. There's also a letter inside, words she wanted thee to have." Dinah clutched the bundle to her chest, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. She had an aunt. She had family who had been searching for her, who cared enough to risk resources and connection to bring her north. It was almost too much to comprehend. As Marcus led her to the door, Dinah suddenly remembered the umbrella, still standing where she had left it the night before, leaning against the wall beside the entrance. She paused, staring at it, this ordinary object that had somehow become a symbol of everything she was leaving behind. "Leave it," Marcus said, seeing her hesitation. "You can't take anything that might identify you. The less you carry, the better." But Dinah found herself picking it up anyway, running her fingers along the smooth wooden handle. This umbrella had been her shield against the storm, had been held over her head 1,000 times by her own hands. It had protected Constance Whitmore from rain and sun, had been a tool of service and subjugation, but it had also been the thing she was holding when she walked into freedom. "I know," she said quietly, and then, in a gesture that felt both spontaneous and deeply significant, she carried the umbrella out into the courtyard behind Margaret's house. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the eaves and pooled in the corners. Dinah opened the umbrella and stood it upright on the ground, wedging the handle between two stones so it stood on its own. Black fabric spread wide against the gray morning sky. It looked absurd, an umbrella standing open in a courtyard with no hand to hold it, no purpose to serve. But something about the image felt right to Dinah, felt like a message she was leaving behind for anyone who might understand. Here stood the symbol of service, abandoned and useless without someone to serve. Here stood the marker of her absence, proof that she had been here and was here no longer. "We need to go," Marcus urged, glancing nervously at the street beyond the house. Dinah took one last look at the standing umbrella, then turned and followed Marcus to the waiting wagon. She climbed into the back where a false floor had been constructed with just enough space for a person to lie flat. Marcus helped her in, and she found herself in complete darkness as the boards were fitted back into place above her. She heard the sounds of crates and barrels being loaded on top, concealing any evidence that the wagon carried human cargo. The journey that followed was one of the hardest things Dinah had ever endured, and she had endured much in her 32 years. The wagon lurched and bumped over rutted roads, every jolt sending pain through her cramped limbs. She couldn't move, could barely breathe in the confined space, and had to fight against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. Hours passed in darkness and discomfort, marked only by the sound of the wheels and the occasional voice of the driver talking to his horses. When the wagon finally stopped and the floor was lifted, Dinah emerged into dazzling sunlight, her legs almost too weak to support her. They were on a farm. She could see fields stretching toward the horizon and a small farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. A woman came out to greet them, white like Margaret Foster but younger, with kind eyes and capable hands that helped Dinah into the house. This became the pattern of her journey north. Days spent hiding in attics and cellars and barns, nights spent traveling in wagons or on foot through forests and along back roads. She met dozens of people who risked everything to help her, some white, some black, some free. Some enslaved themselves, but part of this secret network that funneled people toward freedom. Each person took her part of the way, passed her along like a precious parcel, and she learned to trust quickly and completely because she had no other choice. The journey took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of constant fear, of near misses and close calls, of dogs barking in the distance and torches seen through the trees. Twice they encountered patrols, and Dinah had to hide in a root cellar for 3 days straight, existing on hardtack and water while armed men searched the property above her head. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her already thin frame becoming gaunt, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and stress. But she also discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. When they had to ford a river at night, the water cold and swift, she didn't hesitate. When they walked 20 miles through driving rain because the road patrols were out in force, she kept putting one foot in front of the other. And when a young girl in one of the safe houses, herself fleeing north with her mother, asked Dinah if she was scared, Dinah found herself saying no with surprising conviction. "I'm not scared," she told the girl, whose name was Flora and whose dark eyes were too old for her 7 years. "I'm alive. Maybe for the first time I'm really alive. And that's worth being scared for." The final leg of the journey took them across the Pennsylvania line on a moonless night in late September. Dinah didn't realize they had crossed at first. There was no marker, no dramatic change in the landscape. But the man guiding them, a taciturn farmer named William who had lost a son to consumption and devoted his remaining years to helping people escape slavery, stopped the wagon and turned to her with the first smile she had seen on his weathered face. "Welcome to freedom," he said simply. "You're in Pennsylvania now. No one can own you here." Dinah climbed down from the wagon on trembling legs and stood on free soil for the first time in her life. The night air was cool, autumn already asserting itself this far north, and she could see her breath in small clouds. She spread her arms wide and tipped her head back, looking up at the stars that seemed brighter here than they ever had in Charleston, though she knew that was probably just her imagination, her heart making the world match her joy. Philadelphia was still 2 days away, and William drove her there himself, no longer needing to hide her beneath false floors. She sat beside him on the wagon seat, watching the countryside pass, marveling at the small freedoms she had never experienced before. The freedom to sit in the sun, the freedom to eat when she was hungry, the freedom to speak without first being spoken to. Her Aunt Ruth was waiting when they arrived, standing on the porch of a narrow brick house in a neighborhood where black families owned their own homes and operated their own businesses. Dinah would have walked past her on the street, this well-dressed woman with gray threading through her dark hair. But Ruth knew her immediately, rushing forward with tears streaming down her face. "You look just like her," Ruth said, cupping Dinah's face in her hands. "Just like my sister. Oh, child, we thought we'd lost you forever." That night, sitting in Ruth's warm kitchen with her aunt and her aunt's husband, a serious man named Dr. Harold Winters, who had built a successful medical practice, Dinah learned about the mother she had barely known. Ruth told her stories of a woman who had been fierce and funny and brave, who had learned to read despite it being illegal, who had dreamed of freedom even when it seemed impossible. "She never stopped looking for you," Ruth said, reaching across the table to take Dinah's hand. "Even when they sold her to that plantation in Georgetown, even when she was dying, she made Grace promise to keep looking. She said you had her spirit, said you'd find a way to be free if someone just showed you the path." Dinah thought of the umbrella standing open in Margaret Foster's courtyard, wondered if it was still there or if someone had folded it up and put it away. She liked to imagine it was still standing, a peculiar monument to the moment when she chose herself over safety, freedom, over security. She settled into life in Philadelphia slowly, learning how to navigate a world where she could walk down any street she chose, could earn wages for her labor, could say no without fear of punishment. It wasn't easy. Freedom, she discovered, came with its own challenges. There were still places she couldn't go, things she couldn't do, prejudices and restrictions that reminded her that while she might be legally free, the society she lived in was far from just. But there were also moments of pure, uncomplicated joy. The first time she spent money she had earned herself, buying a length of blue fabric simply because she liked the color. The first time she declined an invitation because she didn't feel like going, not because she wasn't allowed. The first time she woke on a Sunday morning and decided to stay in bed for an extra hour simply because she could. She found work as a seamstress, her years of mending the Whitmore's fine clothes translating into skills that were valuable in Philadelphia's thriving garment trade. She rented a small room above a bakery where the smell of fresh bread wafted up through the floorboards each morning. She made friends, other formerly enslaved people who understood what she had lived through, what she had left behind, what it cost to walk away from everything familiar in pursuit of something better. And sometimes, on rainy days when water streamed down the windows and thunder rolled across the city, Dinah would stand at her window and think about Charleston, about a black umbrella standing open in a courtyard, about a woman she used to be who had been brave enough to walk into a storm and never look back. News filtered north slowly, carried by the network of conductors and station masters who continued to help people flee slavery. Through them, Dinah learned that the Whitmores had indeed offered a reward for her return, a fairly substantial sum that spoke to either Malcolm Whitmore's pride or his genuine financial desperation at losing her labor. But as weeks turned to months and no one came forward with information about her whereabouts, the reward had been withdrawn. She learned that Bessie had been questioned extensively about Dinah's disappearance, but the old woman had claimed complete ignorance, said Dinah had never confided in her about any plans to escape. Whether that was true or whether Bessie had suspected something and chosen to protect Dinah through silence, Dinah would never know. She hoped it was the latter, hoped that Bessie understood and forgave her for leaving without a word. And she learned through a newspaper clipping that someone brought north about the strange case of the standing umbrella. The paper reported in the bemused tone that white journalists used when discussing anything involving black people, that an umbrella had been found standing open in the courtyard of a known Quaker household, and that despite repeated attempts to remove it, The umbrella continued to reappear in the same spot, standing upright on its own. The article suggested various natural explanations, wind currents, some trick of the ground, but it also noted with obvious skepticism the claims of several neighbors that the umbrella opened itself whenever it rained, that they had seen it collapse closed in sunshine and spring open when clouds gathered. Some said it was the ghost of a runaway slave, others that it was a message from the Underground Railroad, a signal that the house remained a safe haven for those fleeing north. Dinah laughed when she heard about this, laughed until tears ran down her face. The idea that her simple gesture, standing an umbrella in a courtyard before fleeing into freedom, had taken on such mythical proportions seemed absurd and beautiful in equal measure. Let them make stories about it, let them wonder and speculate. She knew the truth, that it was just an umbrella, made special only by the moment when she had chosen to leave it behind. As the years passed, Dinah built a life in Philadelphia that was wholly her own. The first winter in the city was the hardest, not because of the cold, though the northern winters bit deeper than anything she had known in Charleston, but because freedom turned out to be more complicated than she had imagined during those long nights of dreaming in the Whitmore attic. Freedom meant making choices, dozens of them every day, and Dinah found herself paralyzed sometimes by the sheer weight of possibility. What dress to wear when no one was there to tell her? What food to buy at the market when she could choose anything her meager wages allowed? Where to walk on a Sunday afternoon when every street was open to her? Ruth and Dr. Winters were patient with her adjustment, understanding in ways that only people who had lived through similar transitions could be. Ruth would sometimes find Dinah standing in the middle of the kitchen, frozen with indecision over something as simple as whether to make coffee or tea, and she would gently guide her niece through the process of trusting her own preferences, her own desires. "You spent 32 years learning not to want anything," Ruth told her one evening as they sat together mending clothes by lamplight. "Now you got to learn how to want again, how to know what you like and don't like. It takes time, honey. Be patient with yourself." Dinah found work within a month of her arrival, hired by a dressmaker named Mrs. Abigail Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had faced her own struggles establishing a business in a city that didn't always welcome outsiders. Mrs. Chen recognized skill when she saw it, and Dinah's years of sewing for the Whitmores had given her an eye for detail and a steadiness with a needle that impressed even the exacting dressmaker. The work was hard, but it was hers. Every stitch she made earned her money that belonged to her, that couldn't be taken away or given to someone else. The first time Mrs. Chen pressed coins into her palm at the end of the week, Dinah had stood on the street corner and cried, not from sadness but from the overwhelming reality that this was her life now, that she could work and be paid and use that money however she chose. She rented a tiny room above a bakery run by a German couple who asked no questions about her past. The room had a single window that looked out onto an alley, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small table with one chair. It was the most beautiful place Dinah had ever lived. She bought a second-hand quilt at the market, blue and white squares sewn by hands she would never know, and every night when she pulled it over herself, she marveled at the simple fact that this quilt was hers, that everything in this room belonged to her and no one else. She met James Porter at a church social in the spring of 1837. Ruth had dragged her along, insisting that Dinah needed to meet people beyond the small circle of family and co-workers. The church was a modest wooden building in the heart of the black neighborhood, and that evening it was filled with people laughing and talking, sharing food and stories in a way that reminded Dinah painfully of the rare moments of joy she had known back in Charleston. Stolen hours when enslaved people gathered and created community in the spaces between their labor. James was standing by the refreshment table, tall and lean, with gray threading through his dark hair, even though he couldn't have been more than 40. He had kind eyes and strong hands, and when he smiled at something his friend said, the smile transformed his entire face from serious to almost boyish. Dinah found herself watching him without meaning to, and when he caught her looking, instead of turning away in embarrassment, she held his gaze. He approached her with an easy confidence, offering her a cup of punch and introducing himself. His voice was deep and measured, with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. She learned later that he had been born in Virginia but freed when his owner died and actually put manumission in his will, a rare kindness that James never took for granted. "I seen you at Mrs. Chen's shop," James said, his grammar slipping into the comfortable patterns of their shared community. "You the one who made that green dress for the mayor's daughter, ain't you? Saw her wearing it when I drove her father to a meeting last week. Fine work that was." Dinah felt herself flush with pleasure at the compliment. "Thank you. Mrs. Chen is a good teacher." "I expect you didn't need much teaching," James said shrewdly. "You got the hands of someone who'd been sewing for years. Where you from originally?" It was a delicate question, one that carried implications they both understood. Asking where someone was from meant asking about their past, and for many people in their community, the past held pain and danger. Dinah appreciated that James asked directly rather than dancing around it. "Charleston," she said quietly. "Came north last year." James nodded slowly, his eyes holding understanding and something else, respect perhaps. "That's a hard journey. I'm glad you made it safe." They talked for an hour that evening, standing by the refreshment table and then moving outside when the church became too warm with all the bodies crowded inside. James told her about his work as a coachman, about the wealthy families he drove and the absurd things he overheard them say, about his 2 horses that he treated better than some folks treated their children. He told her about learning to read from a tutor his former owner had provided, one of the few genuinely kind acts Malcolm Hensley had ever done, and about his dream of one day owning his own livery stable. Dinah found herself telling him things she hadn't meant to share, about the umbrella left standing in Margaret Foster's courtyard, about the 6 weeks of traveling hidden in wagons and barns, about the moment when she had crossed into Pennsylvania and felt free soil beneath her feet for the first time. James listened with complete attention, never interrupting, and when she finished, he simply said, "You're one of the bravest people I ever met." They married a year later in the same church where they had first spoken. It was a small ceremony, just Ruth and Dr. Winters and a handful of friends, but to Dinah it felt more significant than anything that had happened in her life before. She wore a dress she had made herself, pale yellow with tiny white flowers embroidered around the collar, and when James slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Dinah thought her heart might burst from the impossible joy of being chosen, of choosing in return. Their first son, William, was born in 1839, arriving during a snowstorm that blanketed Philadelphia in white silence. Dinah labored for 18 hours, attended by a midwife named Mrs. Johnson who had delivered half the babies in the neighborhood. When they finally placed William in her arms, red-faced and squalling, Dinah looked down at this tiny person who belonged to no one but himself and wept with relief and terror in equal measure. "He's free," she whispered to James, who sat beside the bed holding her hand. "He was born free. Nobody can ever sell him or buy him or own him." James kissed her forehead, his own eyes wet. "That's your gift to him, Dinah. That's what your courage bought. Him and all the children we might have, they get to start their lives as whole people." Their second son, Frederick, named for Frederick Douglass, whose speeches Dinah had heard and been moved by, came 2 years later. And then their daughter Ruth arrived in 1844. a fierce little thing with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn determination. Dinah loved her children with an intensity that sometimes frightened her, a love mixed with constant fear that something would happen to them, that somehow the past would reach forward and snatch away this precious future she had built. She became fiercely protective, insisting that James teach all three children to read and write as soon as they were old enough to hold a pencil. She saved every penny she could, putting aside money for their education, even when it meant going without things she needed. She told them stories about where she had come from, not to burden them with her pain, but to help them understand the price of the freedom they took for granted. "Your mama walked through a storm to get to Philadelphia," James would tell them when they complained about chores or lessons. "She risked everything so you could have choices she never had. Don't ever forget that. Don't ever waste what she bought for you." As her children grew, Dinah became increasingly involved in the abolitionist movement. It started small, donating a few coins to the Underground Railroad Fund at church, attending lectures by speakers who came through Philadelphia talking about the evils of slavery. But gradually, as she grew more confident in her freedom, as the years put distance between her and that August night in Charleston, she became bolder. She began attending meetings at the home of a Quaker couple, Robert and Hannah Davis, who had dedicated their lives to the cause of abolition. The meetings were mixed, black and white people sitting together in the Davis home, drinking tea and discussing strategy for helping people escape slavery and advocating for its complete abolition. Dinah was intimidated at first by the educated voices, the references to philosophers and politicians she had never heard of. But she gradually realized that her experience, her first-hand knowledge of what slavery actually meant, was valuable in ways that all their education couldn't match. The first time she spoke at one of these meetings, her hands shook so badly she had to clasp them in her lap. A white minister from Boston was holding forth about the moral arguments against slavery, using abstract language about natural rights and divine law. When he finished, Dinah found herself raising her hand, her heart pounding. "May I say something?" she asked quietly. Robert Davis nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Dinah, we would value hearing your perspective." Dinah took a breath. "It's just all this talk about morality and rights and such, it's good and true. But I think sometimes we forget slavery isn't an idea to be debated. It's a woman named Bessie who cooked for a family 30 years and watched her children sold away one by one. It's waking every morning knowing you don't own even the clothes on your back. It's being sent out in a storm to fetch a fan your mistress doesn't need just because she can. It's small and large and constant, and it crushes something in your soul that doesn't ever fully heal." The room was silent when she finished. Then Hannah Davis said softly, "Thank you, Dinah. We needed to hear that. Sometimes we who haven't lived it can lose sight of the human reality beneath our theories." After that, Dinah spoke more frequently, and others began to seek out her opinion. She learned that her story, the specifics of her escape and the life she was building afterward, was powerful in ways that abstract arguments weren't. When she told white abolitionists about Constance Whitmore's casual cruelties, they began to understand that evil wasn't always dramatic and obvious. When she talked about the fear that never quite left her, even in freedom, they began to comprehend the lasting damage that slavery inflicted. She became active in helping others who arrived in Philadelphia via the Underground Railroad. She would sit with newly arrived refugees, people still shaking from the trauma of escape, still looking over their shoulders expecting to see slave catchers. She helped them find work and housing, taught them how to navigate the confusing reality of freedom, offered the kind of patient guidance that Ruth had given her. There was a young woman named Clara who arrived in 1848, 17 years old and pregnant, having escaped from a plantation in Maryland. Clara was nearly catatonic with fear, unable to make even simple decisions, flinching every time someone spoke to her. Dinah took her into her own home, gave her the small room William had vacated when he left to attend a teaching college, and slowly, patiently, helped Clara find her way back to herself. "I know it don't feel like it now," Dinah told Clara one night as they sat together shelling peas for supper. "But it gets easier. The fear don't ever go away completely, I won't lie to you about that, but it gets quieter. And one day you'll wake up and realize you made it through a whole day without looking over your shoulder. That's when you know you're really free." Clara's baby, a boy she named Daniel, was born in Dinah's house, with Dinah attending the birth alongside the midwife. When Dinah placed the baby in Clara's arms, she saw the same mixture of joy and terror she had felt with her own children. And she understood that this too was part of her purpose. She had survived not just for herself, but to help others survive, to be the kind of presence in their lives that Ruth had been in hers. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 was a blow that reverberated through Philadelphia's entire black community. Suddenly, no formerly enslaved person was truly safe, even in free states. Federal marshals could come into Pennsylvania, could snatch people from their homes and workplaces, could drag them back south based on nothing more than the word of someone claiming to own them. The law required ordinary citizens to assist in capturing runaways, turning neighbors into potential enemies. Dinah felt the old fear come roaring back with renewed intensity. She had children now, a life she had built brick by careful brick. The thought of being taken back to Charleston, of being sold away from James and William and Frederick and Ruth, was unbearable. For weeks after the law passed, she barely slept, jumping at every unexpected knock on the door, scanning every crowd for faces that might mean danger. James wanted to move to Canada, where they would be truly beyond the reach of American law. Many families in their community were making that choice, abandoning the lives they had built in the United States for the greater safety of British territory. But Dinah found herself reluctant to run again, unwilling to let fear dictate her choices the way slavery had once dictated every moment of her existence. "I didn't walk away from Charleston just to spend the rest of my life running," she told James one night as they lay in bed listening to the sounds of the city outside their window. "If I leave Philadelphia, if I take our children to Canada, it's because we choose to go, not because some unjust law is chasing us. I won't live that way, James, I won't." James held her close, his arms strong around her. "Then we stay. But we have to be careful, Dinah. We have to be smart about this." They developed strategies, plans for what to do if slave catchers came. They identified safe houses where they could hide, people who would warn them if there was danger. They made sure their children knew multiple routes out of the city, practiced what to say if questioned by authorities. It was exhausting and infuriating having to live this way in a place that called itself free, but Dinah refused to let the fear win. She also became more active in resistance efforts. There were cases where federal marshals tried to capture people in Philadelphia, and the black community and their white allies would physically intervene, surrounding the captive and refusing to let them be taken. Dinah participated in several of these actions, using her small frame to wedge herself between marshals and their intended prey, linking arms with others to form human barriers that couldn't easily be broken. In 1851, she was part of a crowd that freed a man named Daniel Webster, no relation to the politician, who was being held in a federal building awaiting transport back to Virginia. The crowd forced their way into the building, overwhelmed the guards through sheer numbers, and spirited Daniel away to safety. Dinah was knocked down in the chaos, bruised her ribs badly, and James was furious with her for taking such risks. "You could have been arrested," he said, his voice tight with fear and anger. "You could have been identified, had your own status questioned. What about our children, Dinah? What would they do without their mother? What kind of mother would I be? Dinah replied quietly. If I taught them to stand by and watch while someone else's freedom is stolen? What kind of world would they inherit if people like us don't fight back against injustice? James couldn't argue with that, though he made her promise to be more careful. But Dinah found she couldn't stop now that she had started. Every person she helped free, every act of resistance she participated in, felt like a small redemption for all the years she had endured slavery silently, accepting her bondage because she had seen no alternative. Her children grew up watching their mother's activism, absorbing lessons about courage and conviction that no school could teach. William became a teacher as he had always planned. But he also became involved in voter registration efforts after the war, helping newly freed people exercise their right to vote despite the obstacles placed in their way. Frederick followed his father's trade, becoming a coachman, but he also used his position to gather intelligence about sympathetic white families who might help fund abolitionist efforts. And Ruth, fierce young Ruth, who had inherited her mother's intensity and her father's calm determination, became a nurse during the Civil War. She was only 17 when the war began, but she lied about her age and joined a group of black women providing medical care to wounded soldiers. The letters she sent home from field hospitals in Virginia and Maryland were full of horror and hope in equal measure, descriptions of suffering that made Dinah weep and accounts of courage that made her proud. She donated money to the Underground Railroad from her modest earnings, wanting to help others find the path to freedom that she had walked. But she never returned to Charleston. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that even in free states, formerly enslaved people could be captured and returned to their owners. And Dinah had children to think about now. She couldn't risk imprisonment or being sent back south. Couldn't risk her family being torn apart the way her own family had been torn from her. During the war years from 1861 to 1865, Dinah threw herself into supporting the Union cause with everything she had. She organized sewing circles of black women who made uniforms and bandages for colored regiments. She raised money to send supplies to contraband camps where formerly enslaved people gathered after fleeing to Union lines. She collected books and primers to send south for the schools that were being established in occupied territories, teaching people who had been forbidden by law to learn how to read and write. Ruth's letters from the battlefield were both her greatest source of pride and her deepest source of fear. Her daughter described caring for men whose legs had been shattered by cannon fire, whose bodies were torn apart by the new rifled muskets that made this war so much deadlier than any that had come before. She wrote about the smell of gangrene and chloroform, about holding the hands of dying soldiers as they called for mothers who would never know where their sons had fallen. But Ruth also wrote about the hope she saw in the eyes of the colored troops, men who had been enslaved and now fought with rifles in their hands for the promise of freedom. She wrote about teaching recovering patients to read during their convalescence, about the tears that ran down the faces of grown men when they successfully decoded their first sentence. She wrote about the day a patient recognized her as the daughter of Dinah Carter, the woman whose story about the standing umbrella had become legend even among the newly freed. "He said he heard about you, Mama," Ruth wrote in a letter dated March 1863. "He said when he was still enslaved in South Carolina, people would tell the story of the woman who walked into a storm and left her umbrella standing. He said it gave them hope, the idea that freedom was possible, that someone like them had made it north and built a life. I told him you were alive and well in Philadelphia, that you had children and grandchildren now, and he wept. He said to tell you thank you for showing the way." Dinah read that letter so many times the paper became soft and fragile at the folds. She had never imagined that her escape, That singular act of courage on a rainy Charleston night would become a story that spread beyond Philadelphia, that would give hope to people she would never meet. It was humbling and overwhelming, this knowledge that her life had meaning beyond her own experience. When the war ended and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States, Dinah stood in her church with hundreds of others and sang hymns of thanksgiving until her voice was hoarse. She was 61 years old by then, her hair completely gray, her body worn down by decades of hard work and harder memories. But that day, she felt young again, felt the same wild hope she had experienced crossing into Pennsylvania 28 years earlier. "It's done," she whispered to James, who stood beside her with tears streaming down his face. "It's really done. No one can be enslaved in this country anymore." But the work, as Dinah had known it would be, was far from finished. The end of slavery was only the beginning of the struggle for true equality. During Reconstruction, Dinah worked with organizations that helped formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. She counseled women who didn't know how to negotiate for wages, how to demand payment for their labor, how to walk away from employers who tried to replicate slavery under different names. She helped families who had been separated during slavery reconnect, writing letters on behalf of people who couldn't write themselves, sending inquiries to every possible source, trying to locate missing mothers and fathers and children. One woman came to her, a middle-aged woman named Sarah who had been sold away from her daughter 30 years earlier when the girl was just 5 years old. Sarah had heard that there were people in Philadelphia who could help find lost family members, and she had traveled all the way from Georgia with nothing but a tattered photograph and a memory of a little girl singing in the quarters. Dinah took Sarah's case personally, writing letters to aid societies and churches throughout the South, describing the daughter Sarah remembered and asking if anyone knew her whereabouts. It took 6 months and dozens of inquiries, but eventually they found her. The daughter, now a woman of 35 with children of her own, was living in Baltimore, working as a laundress. Dinah arranged for Sarah to travel to Baltimore, paid for the train ticket out of her own savings, and stood on the platform waving as Sarah's train pulled away. 3 weeks later, she received a letter from Sarah, written by her daughter because Sarah herself had never learned to read. The letter described their reunion, the tears and embraces, the impossibility of fitting 30 years of life into words, the grandchildren Sarah had never known existed. At the end, Sarah's daughter had added a personal note. "Mrs. Porter, my mother tells me you walked into a storm in Charleston and left your umbrella standing. She says you are a woman who knows what it means to be separated from family and to find them again. Thank you for giving me back my mother. Thank you for refusing to let the past stay buried." These were the moments that sustained Dinah through the difficult years of Reconstruction and its aftermath. When the promise of equality began to erode, when black codes and Jim Crow laws started to replicate many of the restrictions of slavery, when violence against black communities became endemic, Dinah held on to these individual victories. She couldn't change the whole system, but she could change individual lives, and she devoted herself to doing exactly that. She also began in her 60s to write down her story. Her son William, now a respected teacher and community leader, had been urging her for years to record her experiences for posterity. At first, Dinah had resisted, feeling that her story was no more important than any of the thousands of others who had escaped slavery. But William convinced her that every story mattered, that future generations would need to know the details of what slavery had actually been, how it had felt, what it had cost. So Dinah, who had learned to read and write from James during their early years together, began to put words on paper. It was harder than she had anticipated, not the physical act of writing, but the emotional labor of revisiting those years in Charleston. She found herself transported back to the Whitmore house, to the heat of the kitchen and the weight of the laundry basket, to Constance's sharp voice and Bessie's knowing eyes. She remembered things she thought she had forgotten, small details that came rushing back with painful clarity. She wrote about the other enslaved people in the Whitmore household, people whose names she recorded so they wouldn't be lost to history. There was Jacob, who maintained the garden and could make anything grow even in poor soil. There was Lily, younger than Dinah, who had been purchased to help with the sewing and who had the most beautiful singing voice Dinah had ever heard. There was old Moses, who had been enslaved by the Whitmore family for over 40 years, and who told stories about Africa that he had heard from his grandmother, stories about a place where their people had been free. She wrote about the moment she decided to escape, about Marcus Webb appearing at the courtyard gate with his impossible offer of freedom. She wrote about the storm and the umbrella, about walking past Mrs. Ashford's house into uncertainty. She wrote about the fear and the cold and the exhaustion of the journey north, but also about the kindness of strangers, about the network of people who risked everything to help people they didn't know, simply because it was right. The manuscript grew slowly over several years, written in bits and pieces when Dinah had time between her other responsibilities. She shared portions of it with William, who helped her refine the language while maintaining her authentic voice. He suggested that she include more about her life in Philadelphia, not just the escape itself, but what came after, because that too was part of the story. So Dinah wrote about learning to be free, about the paralyzing weight of choice and the gradual discovery of her own preferences and desires. She wrote about meeting James, about the joy and terror of having children who were born free. She wrote about her work with the Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement, about the friends she had made and the lives she had touched. She wrote about watching the nation tear itself apart in civil war and then slowly, painfully, try to put itself back together in a form that at least theoretically included all its people. William eventually helped her find a publisher, a small press in Philadelphia that specialized in first-person accounts of slavery and the Civil War. Her book, titled From Bondage to Freedom, A Charleston Woman's Journey, was published in 1879. It didn't become a bestseller. Books by black women rarely did in that era, but it found its audience. Copies circulated in abolitionist circles, were used in schools teaching about the reality of slavery, were read aloud at church gatherings and community meetings. Dinah received letters from readers, some formerly enslaved themselves, others who had never experienced bondage but wanted to understand it better. A white woman from Maine wrote to say that reading Dinah's account had completely changed how she thought about slavery, had made her realize that it wasn't some abstract evil from the past, but a lived reality that had crushed real human beings with hopes and dreams and families. A formerly enslaved man from Mississippi wrote to say that her story had inspired him to record his own experiences, to ensure that his children and grandchildren would know what he had survived. But perhaps the most meaningful letter came from Charleston itself, from a young black woman named Sarah Hammond, who had been born free after the war. Sarah explained that she was working to document the history of black life in Charleston, collecting stories and interviewing elders, trying to preserve a history that was in danger of being forgotten or distorted. She had heard about the legend of the standing umbrella, had tracked down multiple versions of the story, and had eventually come across Dinah's book in a church library. "I've been searching for the truth behind the legend," Sarah wrote. "Some people say it never happened, that it's just a folktale. Others say it happened, but the woman was caught and brought back, that the umbrella marks the place where she was killed. But you're alive, Mrs. Porter. You made it. You're living proof that the story is true, that people did escape, did build lives in freedom. Would you be willing to answer some questions about your time in Charleston? Would you help me tell this story accurately? Dinah corresponded with Sarah for over a year, answering her questions, providing details about life in antebellum Charleston from an enslaved person's perspective. Sarah was writing a comprehensive history of Black Charleston, and Dinah's first-hand account became a crucial primary source. Through Sarah's questions, Dinah found herself remembering things she hadn't thought about in decades, small details that seemed insignificant but that Sarah insisted were important for understanding the full texture of life during that time. Sometimes she wondered what had become of the Whitmores, whether they had survived the war and its aftermath. Through contacts in Charleston, she learned that Malcolm Whitmore had died in 1853 of a stroke, leaving his widow in seriously reduced circumstances. Constance had been forced to sell the house on Trad Street and move to a smaller residence, had lost most of her enslaved property in the war, and had spent her final years living on the charity of relatives. She died in 1868, bitter and resentful of the world that had changed so dramatically around her. Dinah felt neither satisfaction nor sorrow at this news. The Whitmores had become strangers to her, figures from a past that felt increasingly unreal. What mattered was not what had happened to them, but what had happened to the people they had enslaved. Bessie, she learned, had lived to see freedom, had survived the war and Reconstruction, and had died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 79. Lily had married and had children, grandchildren who were learning to read and write in schools that their grandmother could never have attended. As for Jacob and old Moses, no one seemed to know what had become of them. They had simply disappeared into the chaos of the war years, two more people whose stories would never be fully told, whose experiences would be lost except for the brief mention in Dinah's manuscript. This troubled her deeply, the knowledge that so many lives had left no trace, that history would remember the slaveholders and forget the enslaved unless people like her and Sarah Hammond worked actively to preserve those memories. In her 70s, Dinah began to speak more publicly about her experiences. She gave talks at churches and schools, appeared at commemorations and anniversaries, shared her story with anyone who would listen. She was one of the fortunate ones, she would tell her audiences, one of the relatively few who had escaped and survived and thrived. But for every person like her, there were hundreds who had died still enslaved, who had died trying to escape, who had lived their entire lives in bondage, never knowing any alternative. "Don't make heroes out of us," she said at one such talk, her voice still strong despite her age. "Make heroes out of everyone who survived slavery, whether they escaped or not. Make heroes out of the mothers who kept their children alive in impossible circumstances. Make heroes out of the men who maintained their dignity despite systematic degradation. Make heroes out of everyone who remembered they were human beings even when the law said they were property." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Dinah felt exhausted by these appearances in ways that physical labor had never exhausted her. Telling her story again and again meant reliving it again and again, meant opening wounds she had spent decades trying to heal. But she persisted because the alternative, allowing that history to be forgotten or whitewashed, was unacceptable. Sometimes she wondered what had become of the Whitmores, whether they had recovered from the financial troubles that had plagued them, whether Constance still sat at her dressing table fighting the passage of time, whether Malcolm still pretended to be a benevolent master to the people he held in bondage. Mostly, though, she didn't think about them at all. They were part of a past that grew more distant with each passing year, less real than the life she had built from nothing. In 1863, when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Dinah wept for hours. Tears of relief and rage and grief for all the years lost, all the lives destroyed by the institution of slavery. Her children, who had grown up hearing stories about what their mother had endured, what she had risked to give them freedom, stood with her in their small parlor and bore witness to this moment of transformation. "It's over," her daughter Ruth, named for the aunt who had helped bring Dinah north, said softly. "Mama, it's finally over." But Dinah shook her head. "Not over, child, just beginning. Now comes the hard part, figuring out how to be a country that ain't built on the backs of enslaved people, figuring out how to make real the promise of freedom. That's going to take longer than any of us might live to see." She was right, of course. The war ended, slavery was abolished, but the fight for true equality, for justice and dignity and full citizenship continued long past Dinah's lifetime. She lived to see Reconstruction and its bitter aftermath, lived to see the hope of freedom undermined by black codes and Jim Crow laws, lived to see that legal freedom was only the first step in a much longer journey. But she also lived to see her children educated, her sons becoming a teacher and a minister, her daughter a nurse. She lived to see her grandchildren born into a world where they were legally free from birth, where they could read and write and dream without having those dreams systematically destroyed. She lived to see progress, slow and incomplete but real nonetheless. In her later years, Dinah liked to sit on the small porch of the house she and James had eventually been able to purchase, watching the neighborhood children play in the street. Philadelphia had changed dramatically since she first arrived, the black community growing and thriving despite the prejudices and restrictions they faced. There were churches and schools, businesses and mutual aid societies, a whole world built by people who had been told they were property, but insisted on being recognized as human. On rainy days, she would often think about that August night in Charleston, about walking into a storm with nothing but a black umbrella to protect her. She thought about the moment of decision in that alley, when she had walked past Mrs. Ashford's house and into uncertainty. It had been terrifying and exhilarating, the scariest thing she had ever done and the most important. The story of the standing umbrella persisted, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some versions claimed the umbrella turned red as blood on certain nights. Others said it marked the spot where a slave woman had been murdered and her ghost continued to wait for justice. Still others insisted it was a sign of divine intervention, God's protection over those who helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Dinah never corrected these stories when she heard them. Let people believe what they wanted. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any ghost story. The truth was that she had been brave for one moment when bravery mattered most, and that moment had changed the entire trajectory of her life. She died in 1892 at the age of 88, surrounded by her children and grandchildren in a bed she owned in a house she had helped pay for. Her daughter Ruth held her hand as she slipped away, and Dinah's last words were about the rain, about water falling from the sky and washing everything clean, about the beauty of storms and the peace that followed them. James had passed away 3 years earlier, his heart finally giving out after decades of hard work and harder worry. Dinah had mourned him deeply, this man who had chosen to love her when she was still learning to love herself, who had built a family with her from nothing but hope and determination. In his final months, as he grew weaker and the cough that had plagued him for years became constant, they would sit together on their porch and talk about the life they had made. "We did good, didn't we?" James had asked her one evening, his voice thin but still holding that warmth she had fallen in love with over 50 years earlier. "Our children got education, got chances. They're making their own way in the world. That's something, ain't it?" "That's everything," Dinah had replied, holding his hand, feeling how fragile it had become, all bones and papery skin where there had once been such strength. "We did more than survive, James. We built something that will outlast us. Our grandchildren, their children, they'll carry our story forward. They'll know what we came from and how far we traveled. Now lying in her own bed with Ruth's hand in hers and her grandchildren gathered around, Dinah felt a deep peace settling over her. She had lived long enough to see the turn of a new decade, long enough to witness the first generation of her family born entirely free reach adulthood and start families of their own. Her oldest grandson, William's son David, was studying law at Howard University. Her granddaughter Margaret, Frederick's eldest, was teaching at a school for black children in Philadelphia. Ruth's son James, named for his grandfather, was learning the printing trade and talked about starting his own newspaper one day. These were the fruits of her courage, the harvest of that single decision made on a rainy Charleston night so many years ago. If she had stayed, if she had returned to the Whitmore house with Constance's fan, there would have been no William or Frederick or Ruth. There would have been no David or Margaret or young James. Her choice to be free had rippled forward through time, creating possibilities that multiplied with each generation. As her breathing grew shallower and the room began to fade around the edges of her vision, Dinah thought about the umbrella one last time. She wondered if it was still there, if some trace of it remained in that Charleston courtyard, or if it had long since rotted away, returned to the earth like all material things eventually do. It didn't matter, really. The umbrella had never been the important part. What mattered was the choice it represented, the moment when she had decided that her own freedom was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any hardship that might follow. "Mama?" Ruth's voice came from far away, though Dinah could feel her daughter's hand tight around her own. "Mama, can you hear me?" Dinah squeezed back weakly, wanting to reassure Ruth that she was not afraid, that she was ready for whatever came next. She had lived 88 years, had survived slavery and escaped to freedom, had married and raised children and seen grandchildren born, had fought for justice and helped others find their own paths to liberation. What more could one person do with a life? The rain she heard was memory, not reality, the storm from that long-ago August night mixing with all the other storms she had weathered in the decades since. Water washing away the past, cleansing the wounds that never fully healed, carrying her toward some distant shore where the chains of history could no longer bind her. She died with a smile on her face, her last breath a whisper that sounded like freedom. At her funeral, which was attended by over 100 people whose lives she had touched, the minister spoke about Dinah's courage, about the long journey from Charleston to Philadelphia, from bondage to freedom. He spoke about the umbrella, about how sometimes an ordinary object could become a symbol of extraordinary transformation. "She left that umbrella standing," he said, his voice carrying through the crowded church, "as a testimony to faith and courage. She left it standing to say, I was here, I was enslaved, and I chose freedom. She left it standing as a marker for others who would follow, as a sign that the path to freedom existed if one was brave enough to take it. And she left it standing as a reminder that we cannot simply fold up our struggles and put them away neatly when the storm has passed. We must keep them visible, must remember what was endured and what was overcome, must never forget the price of freedom." William spoke as well, his voice breaking as he talked about the mother who had given him the gift of freedom before he was even born. He read from her manuscript passages that described her life in Charleston, her escape, her arrival in Philadelphia. He wanted everyone present to understand that Dinah Carter Porter was not just a symbol or a legend, but a real woman who had suffered real pain and fought real battles and built a real life from the ruins of slavery. "My mother would tell me," William said, looking out over the congregation, "that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was being terrified and doing the necessary thing anyway. She was afraid every day of her life after she escaped, afraid of being caught, afraid of being sent back, afraid of losing the life she had built. But she never let that fear stop her from living fully, from fighting for justice, from helping others find their own freedom. That's the legacy she leaves us, not just her descendants, but all of us who believe in freedom and equality. She leaves us the example of someone who refused to let fear have the final word. Ruth spoke too, though she could barely get through her remarks without breaking down. She talked about her mother's strength, about how Dinah had held their family together during the difficult years of the Fugitive Slave Act, when every knock on the door could have meant disaster. She talked about watching her mother help other refugees, sitting with traumatized women and men, teaching them how to navigate freedom when they had never been allowed to make a single choice about their own lives. She never thought of herself as special, Ruth said. She would always say that hundreds of people made the same choice she did, that thousands more would have if they'd had the opportunity. She saw herself as ordinary, but there was nothing ordinary about my mother's compassion, her determination, her absolute refusal to accept injustice. She taught me that we are all responsible for fighting tyranny wherever we find it, that freedom means nothing if we don't extend it to everyone. Among the mourners was Sarah Hammond, the young historian from Charleston who had corresponded with Dinah over the years. She had traveled all the way from South Carolina for the funeral, bringing with her the comprehensive manuscript she had finally completed, a history of Black Charleston that featured Dinah's story prominently. After the service, she approached the family and gave them a copy of her work, dedicated to Dinah's memory. She was one of the last people who could speak firsthand about slavery in Charleston, Sarah told William and his siblings. Her testimony was invaluable to my research. But more than that, her life showed me what history really is. It's not just dates and events. It's people making choices, often impossible choices, and living with the consequences of those choices. Your mother's choice to be free changed not just her life, but countless others. That ripple effect is still going, will keep going as long as we remember her story. The family also received a telegram from Marcus Webb's daughter, Constance, named ironically for Dinah's former mistress, though Marcus could never have known the connection. Marcus had died several years earlier, but he had told his children about his work with the Underground Railroad, about the people he had helped escape to freedom. Constance wrote that her father had considered Dinah one of his greatest successes, not just because she had made it north safely, but because of everything she had built afterward, the life she had created, and the others she had helped in turn. In the weeks following Dinah's death, letters continued to arrive from around the country, people who had known her or had been helped by her, or had simply been inspired by her story. A man who was nearly 70 wrote from Ohio to say that as a child he had been part of a family that Dinah had reunited after they had been separated during slavery. He described the joy of that reunion, said it had shaped his entire understanding of what freedom meant. The freedom not just to be unowned, but to be connected to the people you loved. A woman from Massachusetts wrote about attending one of Dinah's talks at an abolitionist meeting in the 1850s. She had been a young white woman then, raised in a family that opposed slavery but in abstract, theoretical ways. Hearing Dinah speak about the daily realities of being enslaved, the casual cruelties and the constant degradation, had radicalized her. She had devoted her life to teaching and had spent 40 years ensuring that her students understood slavery not as some distant historical wrong, but as a human tragedy that had devastated millions of lives. William collected these letters carefully, adding them to the family archives he was building. He understood that his mother's story was bigger than just their family, that it belonged to history, and he wanted to preserve every scrap of evidence about her life and impact. He continued her work of recording stories, interviewing other formerly enslaved people in Philadelphia, ensuring that their testimonies would not be lost. Frederick took a different approach to honoring their mother's memory. He used his savings, supplemented by contributions from his siblings, to establish a scholarship fund in Dinah's name. The scholarship would provide financial support for young black women pursuing education, particularly those whose families had been enslaved. The first recipient was a girl named Alice Freeman, whose grandmother had been one of the refugees Dinah had helped when she first arrived in Philadelphia decades earlier. Ruth, true to her mother's activist spirit, became even more involved in the fight for civil rights. She joined organizations working to combat the Jim Crow laws that were proliferating across the South, trying to turn the promise of freedom into renewed subjugation. She traveled to speak at churches and meetings, always beginning her remarks with the story of her mother walking into a storm and leaving an umbrella standing. "My mother's generation fought to end slavery," Ruth would tell her audiences. "Our generation must fight to make freedom meaningful. Legal freedom is not enough if it doesn't come with economic opportunity, with education, with the right to vote, with equal protection under the law. My mother didn't escape slavery just so her children and grandchildren could live as second-class citizens in a supposedly free society. We owe it to her and to everyone who suffered under slavery to finish the work they started." The story of the standing umbrella took on new dimensions after Dinah's death. Her children and grandchildren shared the true version. The story, as Dinah herself had told it, had every opportunity. But the legend had taken on a life of its own, mutating and evolving as it passed from person to person, generation to generation. By the early 1900s, multiple versions existed in circulation. Some said the umbrella had been stolen from the courtyard and that whoever took it was cursed with bad luck, forced to wander homeless through the streets of Charleston until they returned it. Others claimed that the umbrella could still be seen on the anniversary of Dinah's escape, materializing out of mist and rain exactly at midnight. Still others insisted that if you stood in the exact spot where the umbrella had been left and called Dinah's name 3 times, she would appear as a spirit and grant you the courage to face your own fears. Dinah's grandchildren found these embellishments both amusing and frustrating. The truth was powerful enough without supernatural elements, they argued. A woman had made a choice, had risked everything, and had won her freedom. That was the story that mattered, not ghost tales and curses. But Sarah Hammond, the Charleston historian, saw value in the legends. She argued that the proliferation of stories, however distorted, showed how deeply Dinah's act had resonated with people. The umbrella had become a symbol that transcended its original context, representing not just one woman's escape, but the universal human longing for freedom and self-determination. "Let people tell their versions," Sarah wrote to William in 1903. "The core truth remains constant. Someone enslaved became free through an act of tremendous courage. If some people need to add supernatural elements to process that truth, so be it. The important thing is that the story survives, that future generations remember that resistance was possible, that people did fight back against slavery in whatever ways they could." As the 20th century progressed and the generation who had been born enslaved began to die out, the urgency of preserving their stories became more apparent. Dinah's children recognized that they were among the last who could provide first-hand accounts of what life had been like during that transitional period from slavery to freedom. William, in particular, threw himself into this work, conducting hundreds of interviews, filling notebooks with testimony that might otherwise have been lost. He discovered in his research that Margaret Foster, the Quaker woman who had first sheltered Dinah on her escape night, had kept detailed records of every refugee she had helped. Her journals, preserved by her descendants, mentioned Dinah specifically, noting the night she arrived and describing her as terrified but determined, carrying herself with a dignity that slavery could not destroy. William wept when he read those words, imagining his mother as she must have been at 32. taking the biggest risk of her life with no guarantee of success. The journals also confirmed the detail about the umbrella, though Margaret's account was characteristically practical. She left an umbrella standing in my courtyard, wedged between stones. When I questioned this, she said it felt important, though she could not explain why. I left it there for several weeks, but eventually the wind knocked it over and the weather destroyed it. Still, I often thought of that umbrella in the years after. It seemed to me a small rebellion, leaving behind a tool of service as if to say, I am done serving. This account became the definitive historical record, the version that scholars would cite when writing about the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. But the legends persisted alongside the historical facts. Two parallel traditions that sometimes reinforced and sometimes contradicted each other. In 1936, exactly 100 years after Dinah's escape, her descendants organized a commemoration in Philadelphia. Over 200 people attended, including historians, civil rights activists, and descendants of others who had been enslaved. William, now in his 90s and one of the last surviving children of formerly enslaved parents, gave a speech that brought the entire assembly to tears. "A century ago," he said, his voice still strong despite his age, "my mother walked away from slavery into a storm. She left behind an umbrella, a simple object that has become a symbol of something much larger. But let us remember what she did not leave behind. She did not leave behind her humanity. She did not leave behind her hope. She did not leave behind her determination to be free. Those things she carried with her across 6 weeks of danger, across state lines, across the threshold into a new life. And she passed them on to her children, who are passing them on to their children, who will pass them on to generations yet unborn." Years later, decades after Dinah's death, researchers trying to document stories of the Underground Railroad would search for evidence of the standing umbrella. They found references to it in several contemporary accounts, newspaper articles, and diary entries that mentioned this peculiar phenomenon. But the umbrella itself, if it had ever really stood on its own as the stories claimed, was long gone. Probably claimed by some practical person who saw no use in letting a perfectly good umbrella go to waste. What remained was the story, passed down through generations, changing and evolving but retaining its essential truth. A woman enslaved in Charleston walked into the rain carrying a black umbrella, and when the storm passed, she had vanished into freedom. The umbrella, standing alone in a courtyard, became a symbol of her courage, a testament to the moment when she chose herself over the only security she had ever known. In Charleston, even now, there are people who claim to know where the courtyard was, who will point to a spot in the old city and say, "This was where it happened. This was where Dinah Carter left her umbrella standing." Some say that on rainy August nights, if you stand in the right place and look carefully, you can still see it. A black umbrella open against the storm, waiting for a woman who will never return because she found something better. Something worth more than any umbrella could ever protect her from. And maybe that's true. Maybe some echoes of the past are so powerful they leave impressions on the present. Visible shadows of moments when history pivoted on the choice of a single person. Or maybe it's just a story, beautiful and inspiring but ultimately fictional, a way for later generations to make sense of courage they can barely comprehend. Either way, Dinah Carter's story endures, the woman who was born enslaved and died free. The woman who walked into a storm with nothing but hope and determination. The woman who left her umbrella standing because she no longer needed its protection, because she was finally, completely, wholly her own.